My wife, Jessica, and I have been together for over a decade. We met in college, classic love story, really. She was the sharp-witted, ambitious woman who always had this fire in her, the kind that just draws you in. I think I fell for that intensity before I even realized it. Anyway, we got married young. I was 25, she was 23. We've had our ups and downs, like any couple, but I always thought we were solid. Or at least, I wanted to believe we were solid. Lately, things have felt off. It started small. She became more secretive, but she's always been a bit guarded, so I didn't push too much. Then she started going out more. At first, it was under the pretext of work. She's got a pretty demanding job in marketing, and late nights were never uncommon for her. But something didn't sit right. She was cagey, defensive even, whenever I asked about her day. That was new. I'm not going to lie, I didn't think much of it at first. I chalked it up to stress, maybe burnout. God knows we all go through those phases. But then she started making these odd comments. Little jabs that she'd disguise as jokes. Stuff about how I'd never understand certain parts of her life, or how I couldn't keep up with her anymore. Always said with a smile, but there was this underlying coldness that I hadn't seen before. That's when I started paying closer attention. You know how they say you notice the small things and you suspect something's wrong? Well, it's true. I noticed her phone was always on silent, always face down. I noticed she'd start dressing up just to go out for drinks with the girls. And yeah, I even noticed how she suddenly became more protective of her laptop. But I tried to brush it all aside, convincing myself I was being paranoid. So, where was I? Right, the night things really started to shift. It was a Friday, and Jess had told me she was going out with some coworkers after work, again. Now, normally, I wouldn't have cared. But this time, something just felt wrong. She'd been leaving the house early in the morning and getting home late for weeks. I could feel her slipping away, but every time I tried to bring it up, she'd brush me off with some snappy comment or make me feel like I was the one overreacting. That night, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I called her. Not a text, an actual call. It went straight to voicemail. Now, I know, people's phones die, or they're in the middle of something. But I had that gut feeling, the one that tells you something's up but you really don't want to face it. I waited an hour and called again. Same thing, voicemail. By this point, my heart was racing, and my mind started going into overdrive. I tried convincing myself it was nothing, that I was just being insecure or jealous. But the anxiety was too much, so I did something I'm not proud of. I checked the Find My app we share. We both had our locations on for safety reasons, especially with her working late sometimes. Her location popped up. She wasn't at the bar she'd mentioned. She wasn't even anywhere near work. Instead, her pin was at some random residential area on the other side of town. I remember staring at the screen, just trying to make sense of it. My stomach dropped. The address was unfamiliar. None of our friends lived in that part of the city, and I couldn't think of a single reason why she'd be there. I decided to wait. Maybe there was a simple explanation, right? An after-party, a work thing, anything. But as the hours ticked by, the anxiety only grew. It was now past midnight, and Jess still hadn't responded to my calls or texts. Then, around 1 a.m., she walked in the door. Calm, collected, and way too casual for someone who had supposedly just been out with friends. She looked at me like I was the crazy one for waiting up. When I asked how her night went, she gave me this vague answer about drinks, laughs, and, oh, it wasn't anything special. No mention of why she'd been in that random neighborhood. I didn't confront her about it then. I couldn't. I didn't have the proof, and I didn't want to jump to conclusions without knowing for sure. But that night, lying in bed next to her, I barely slept. My mind was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. And oh, how right I was. The next few days felt like I was living in a haze. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about the lies she was telling without blinking an eye. But at the same time, I was doubting myself, thinking maybe I was overreacting. I mean, we'd been together for so long, how could she possibly be hiding something from me for this long? But then, I caught a break. A few days after that night, Jess left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. She had to rush out for some meeting, and for the first time in a while, I was home when she wasn't. The temptation was sitting there, glaring at me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the screen. Now, don't get me wrong, I'd never been the type to invade her privacy. But everything in my gut was screaming at me to just look. So, I did. And the first thing I saw when I clicked on her messages. A conversation with someone I'd never heard of. Alex. My hand started shaking as I scrolled up. I couldn't see much at first, just work stuff, casual conversation. But the more I read, the more the tone shifted. Flirty comments, late-night messages. And then, there it was, talk of their last time together. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My mind went blank, and my body just went cold. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. All the suspicions, all the doubts, suddenly, it was all laid out in front of me. But I still didn't know who this person was. Jess had never mentioned anyone named Alex before. My head was spinning, and a part of me wanted to smash that laptop, throw it out the window, confront her immediately. But I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to know more before I could face her, before I could really understand what the hell was going on. That night, when she came home, I acted like nothing was wrong. I went through the motions, made dinner, asked about her day, tried to hide the fact that I was dying inside. Meanwhile, all I could think about was who this Alex person could be. And how long had this been going on? I didn't sleep that night either. The paranoia was eating me alive. The worst part? She acted completely normal. No sign of guilt, no awkwardness. If anything, she was more relaxed, even happier. I guess I should have seen that as a sign, but in the moment, it just messed with my head even more. I needed a plan. I needed to figure out who Alex was and how deep this rabbit hole went. And I knew I was getting closer to finding out the truth, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to uncover. After that night, I couldn't shake the thought of Jess and Alex. I had to know who he was, where they'd been meeting, and just how far this whole thing had gone. It was all-consuming. I found myself overanalyzing everything she said and did. Every time she laughed at her phone or went to work early, my stomach twisted in knots. Then one day, an opportunity fell into my lap. Jess had another one of her late nights with the girls. Same routine, dressed up, full makeup, hair perfect. But something felt off, like she was almost too eager to get out of the house. I didn't want to sit around spiraling again, so this time, I followed her. I know. That sounds insane, but at that point, I was desperate for answers. She drove out to that same residential area, the one from the night I'd checked her location. I parked down the street and waited, my heart pounding the whole time. A part of me hoped she'd come out of some regular friend's house and prove me wrong, that all of this was just me being paranoid. But I wasn't that lucky. After about an hour, she walked out, hand in hand with a guy. I didn't get a clear look at his face at first, but they were way too close for it to be just friends. They stood by her car, laughing, talking softly. She kissed him. And then, the guy turned slightly, just enough for me to see his face. I froze. It wasn't just some random guy from her work. It wasn't some new fling. It was James, one of my closest friends. James and I had known each other for years. We met at work, hit it off right away, and had been tight ever since. I trusted him. Hell, we'd even gone on double dates together, me with Jess, and him with his girlfriend, Laura. They seemed perfect together. I never had a clue. I can't even begin to describe the feeling that hit me when I saw him with my wife. I was paralyzed, rage, betrayal, confusion. I didn't know whether to scream or break down right there in my car. This was the guy I used to grab beers with, the guy who helped me move into our first home. And here he was, kissing my wife like it was the most normal thing in the world. I sat there for a while, just staring at them, trying to process it all. Everything felt like it was crashing down on me at once. Jess had been lying to me for 2.5 years, and my friend, someone I trusted, had been right there, involved the entire time. I drove home that night in a daze, barely able to see straight. I felt like I was suffocating, and I didn't know how to confront her. How could I? How do you even begin to process something like this? But the confrontation was coming. There was no way I could sit on this any longer. And when I did finally confront Jess, well, that's when things got really ugly. The next morning, I woke up in a fog. The weight of what I'd seen last night hit me like a truck as soon as my eyes opened. Jess was already up, acting like nothing had changed, like she wasn't secretly kissing one of my closest friends in some random part of town the night before. I could feel the rage bubbling inside me, but I wasn't ready to explode just yet. I needed to gather myself. I spent most of that day trying to figure out how to approach her, but every time I replayed it in my head, I'd get stuck in this loop of anger and heartbreak. How could she do this to me? To us? And with James, of all people. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. That evening, after she'd settled in for the night, I finally snapped. I remember standing in the kitchen, gripping the counter, staring at her across the room while she scrolled through her phone. My voice came out sharper than I intended when I asked, "How was your night out with the girls?" She glanced up, smiling casually. "Oh, it was fun. You know, same old stuff. Just catching up." That was it. I couldn't hold back anymore. "So, when exactly did catching up start involving my best friend James?" I said, my voice cold and steady, despite the chaos swirling inside me. Her face went pale. For a split second, I could see the panic flash across her eyes before she quickly tried to compose herself. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, pretending to be confused. But I knew better. I had seen it. "Don't lie to me, Jess. I know everything. I saw you last night. With him." My voice was rising, my hands trembling with the effort it took to keep myself together. "How long has this been going on?" Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She was caught, and she knew it. Her whole body language changed. Gone was the confident, cool exterior she usually had. Now, she just looked small. Like she didn't know how to get out of this. "Answer me," I shouted, slamming my hand down on the table, making her jump. "How long have you been lying to me?" After a long, heavy silence, she finally spoke. 2.5 years, she whispered, barely loud enough to hear. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. 2.5 years. That's how long she'd been betraying me. That's how long she and James had been sneaking around behind my back, while I had been completely in the dark, trusting them both. Why? My voice cracked, not out of anger this time, but out of pain. Why him? Why anyone? She didn't say anything at first, just stared at the floor. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she muttered, "It just happened. It wasn't planned, I swear. But things with us weren't great, and James, he understood me in ways you didn't." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Understood you? He's been my friend for years. You destroyed 2 relationships for what? For someone to understand you?" The room was spinning. I wanted to scream at her, to throw her out, but all I could feel was this deep, crushing sadness. How had it come to this? I needed to get out of there. I couldn't even look at her anymore. I grabbed my jacket and stormed out the front door without another word. As I got into my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house. As I drove aimlessly through the night, 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. How could she betray me like this? How could James do this to me? And what the hell was I supposed to do now? All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. I don't remember how long I drove that night. The roads all blurred together as I replayed everything in my head, over and over. Every laugh, every shared moment between Jess and James that I'd never thought twice about, suddenly it all took on a new meaning. I kept wondering how I'd missed it, how they'd both managed to lie to my face for over 2 years. I eventually pulled into an empty parking lot. It was past midnight, and the world around me was completely still. It was just me, sitting there in the dark, trying to make sense of my life falling apart. I must have sat there for hours because my phone started buzzing with messages. Jess, obviously. She was texting non-stop, asking where I was, saying we needed to talk, that we could figure this out. Figure what out? I couldn't even process what she meant by that. What was there to figure out after what she'd done? Eventually, I drove to my brother's house. I didn't know where else to go. It was late, but I knew he'd be awake, he always was. I called him from outside his place, and the moment he heard my voice, he knew something was wrong. I didn't even have to explain, I just told him I needed to talk, and he let me in without asking any questions. When I walked into his place, I must have looked like a wreck because the first thing he said was, "Jesus, man, what the hell happened?" I tried to hold it together, but the second I sat down on his couch, I just broke. I told him everything, about Jess, about James, about the affair, how long it had been going on. The more I talked, the more the reality of it hit me, and I could feel the anger rising up again, mixing with the hurt. He just sat there, listening, shaking his head. "Man, I don't even know what to say," he muttered after I finished. "James? Your own friend? That's messed up beyond words." "I know." I wiped my face, trying to keep myself from completely losing it. "I feel like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. They've been doing this right under my nose." My brother nodded. "It's not on you, though. They hid it because they knew what they were doing was wrong. That's on them, not you." I stayed at his place that night. I couldn't go back home, not after everything. Jess kept blowing up my phone, but I ignored her. I wasn't ready to deal with her or her excuses, and I sure as hell wasn't ready to confront James. Just thinking about him made my blood boil. The next morning, I woke up to even more messages. Jess had gone from apologizing to justifying her actions, saying how lonely she had felt in our marriage, how James had been there for her when I wasn't. I almost threw my phone across the room. It was like she was trying to make me the bad guy, like I had driven her into his arms. I knew I couldn't avoid this forever. I had to confront James. I needed answers from him, face to face, no more hiding behind texts or lies. So I called him. He picked up after a couple of rings, his voice casual, as if nothing had happened. "Hey man, what's up?" I didn't waste time. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold. "Face to face." There was a pause. Sure. "About what?" "You know damn well what it's about. I'll be at your place in an hour." I didn't give him a chance to respond before hanging up. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through me as I got into my car, my hands gripping the wheel tight. I wasn't sure what I was going to say or how this was going to go down, but I knew I needed to look him in the eye and hear his side of this mess. The drive to his place felt like the longest one of my life. My mind was racing with a mix of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. This wasn't just about Jess anymore, this was about one of my closest friends stabbing me in the back. When I finally pulled up to his house, I had to sit for a moment, trying to calm myself down. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every part of me wanted to storm in there and demand answers. But I knew if I let my emotions take over, this would spiral out of control. I walked up to the door and knocked. When he opened it, his face immediately fell. He knew. He knew why I was there. We stood there in silence for a moment before he finally spoke. "Let's talk inside." I stepped inside James' house, and the tension between us was thick. He gestured toward the living room, and I followed him in, my heart racing and my mind trying to stay focused. I didn't want to explode, not yet. I needed to hear him speak first, to hear whatever excuse or twisted justification he had for all this. He sat down on the couch, looking nervous as hell. I stayed standing. I wasn't here to get comfortable. I was here for the truth. So, I started, barely able to keep my voice steady. "When were you going to tell me? Or were you planning to just keep cheating my wife behind my back forever?" James couldn't meet my eyes. He stared down at the floor, rubbing the back of his neck like he was trying to figure out what to say. After what felt like an eternity, he finally muttered, "Man, I'm sorry. I don't even know how to explain it." "Try," I said coldly. "You owe me that much, don't you think?" He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a glimpse of guilt in his eyes. But it wasn't enough. No amount of guilt could erase what he had done. "It just happened, man," he said, his voice weak. "I never meant for it to go this far. I swear to you, it wasn't like we were plotting against you or anything. It started when Jess and I were hanging out more. We were both going through rough patches, and..." "A rough patch?" I cut him off, my anger starting to rise again. "Is that what you're calling this? You've been sleeping with my wife for over 2 years, and that's just a rough patch to you?" He flinched but didn't respond. I could see he was struggling, but I didn't care. I wanted him to feel every ounce of the betrayal I was carrying. "I trusted you, James. You were one of my closest friends. And this is how you repay me?" My voice cracked, and I could feel the raw pain seeping into every word. "I didn't plan this," he said quickly. "It wasn't like that. I know it's not an excuse, but it just happened. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I was in too deep. But I never wanted to hurt you. Never wanted to hurt me." I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. "Every time you slept with her, you were hurting me. Every time you came to my house, looked me in the eye, and pretended to be my friend, you were betraying me." James ran his hands through his hair, visibly struggling to come up with something to say. But nothing he could have said would make this better. I stepped closer to him, my fists clenched at my sides. "Did she mean anything to you? Or was this just some fling?" He looked up, and I saw the hesitation in his eyes before he spoke. "It wasn't just a fling." That answer hit me harder than anything else. My stomach twisted. So it wasn't just lust, it wasn't just some mistake. He had feelings for her. "You're in love with her, aren't you?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond right away, but the silence was all the confirmation I needed. I took a deep breath, trying to control the rage and heartbreak that were now at war inside me. "You've been sneaking around with my wife, lying to me for 2.5 years, and now you're sitting here telling me you love her? I didn't mean for this to happen, man. I swear." He looked up at me, his face pale. "I didn't want to ruin everything. I never meant for this to go on this long, but I can't change how I feel. I'm sorry." I shook my head, backing away, my mind spinning. "Sorry? You're sorry? You think that makes any of this okay?" He didn't answer. What could he say? There was no coming back from this. I felt a surge of adrenaline, and I almost lunged at him, the rage inside me boiling over. But I stopped myself. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down, not here. I turned toward the door, feeling the weight of every step as I moved away from him. Just as I reached the door, I paused and turned back to him. You and Jess deserve each other. But don't think for a second that you're off the hook. You destroyed our friendship, and you wrecked my life. I hope it was worth it. Without waiting for a response, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. As I got back in my car, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. The anger was still there, but underneath it all, I was just tired. Tired of the lies, tired of the betrayal. I knew this wasn't over. There was still Jess to deal with. But right then, in that moment, I just needed space, space to think, space to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. And no matter what, I knew one thing for sure, my life, my marriage, my friendships, they were all shattered. And there was no going back from here. I drove for a while after leaving James' place. My head was pounding, and I could barely keep my thoughts straight. The conversation had left me feeling numb, like the world around me was spinning out of control and I had no way to stop it. As I pulled up to the house, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach tighten again. I wasn't ready to face Jess, not after everything I'd just learned. But what choice did I have? I couldn't hide forever. We needed to have it out, to talk, or scream, about what came next. I stepped inside the house, feeling like a stranger in my own home. The lights were dim, and the air felt eerily quiet, almost as if the house itself knew something was wrong. I called out Jess's name, expecting her to come downstairs or respond with that fake, sweet tone she always used when she was trying to play innocent. But there was no answer. I headed toward the stairs, feeling this growing sense of dread. Something was off, and the silence only made it worse. I climbed the steps, one by one, trying to prepare myself for whatever confrontation was about to happen. I was ready for an argument, for more lies, for tears and excuses. But I wasn't ready for what I was about to walk into. The door to our bedroom was slightly ajar. That's when I heard it. Muffled voices. Laughter. The unmistakable sound of bodies moving on the bed. I froze in the hallway, my mind going blank. No, this couldn't be happening, not again. I had just confronted her about James. She knew I'd found out. There was no way she could be this reckless, this brazen. But the sounds coming from inside the room told a different story. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw them. Jess was in our bed, tangled up with another man. They hadn't even heard me come in. They were so wrapped up in each other, laughing, kissing, completely oblivious to the fact that I was standing there, watching them. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, staring at the scene in front of me, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The man wasn't James. He was a stranger, someone I'd never seen before in my life. It was as if the floor had dropped out from under me. The betrayal with James had already shattered me, but this? This was something else entirely. She wasn't just cheating with one person. She was cheating with whoever she wanted, whenever she wanted. I finally found my voice, though it came out as a low, angry growl. What the hell is this? They both jumped, startled, scrambling to cover themselves. Jess's eyes went wide with shock, her face pale as she realized I was standing there, catching her in the act. Tom. She stammered, grabbing the sheets and pulling them up around her. The guy beside her just sat there, frozen, like he had no idea what to do. What the hell are you doing in my bed? I yelled, the anger exploding out of me. You really couldn't wait, could you? It wasn't enough to around behind my back with James, now you're bringing random guys into our house. Tom, please, let me explain, Jess started, but I cut her off. Explain what? That you're a liar. a cheater? That you've been cheating around behind my back with God knows how many people? You think I didn't already know about James? I just confronted him. But this, I gestured toward the man, who was still sitting there like a deer in headlights, this is beyond anything I could have imagined. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She knew she couldn't talk her way out of this one. Not this time. I turned to the guy, who had finally started to get his clothes back on. Get the hell out of my house, I said, my voice icy. Now. He didn't argue. He grabbed his things and practically ran for the door. Once he was gone, I turned back to Jess, who was still sitting there on the bed, tears starting to form in her eyes. Tom, she began again, but I was done listening. You don't get to talk, I said, my voice shaking with fury. You've lied to me, humiliated me, and now you've turned our marriage into a joke. Do you even realize how low you've sunk? She started to cry, but it didn't move me. Not this time. I want you out, I said, my voice cold and final. Pack your things and get out of my house. We're done. Jess looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, but I didn't care. She'd made her choices, and I wasn't going to stick around to be her backup plan anymore. Without waiting for her to respond, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. As I left the house, I felt a strange sense of relief. The pain was still there, the betrayal still burned, but at least now I knew the truth. At least now I could finally move on, from Jess, from the lies, from all of it. The days that followed were a whirlwind of anger, pain, and decisions I never thought I'd be making. After that night, I couldn't even stand to be in the same house as Jess. I crashed at my brother's place for a while, sorting through the chaos in my head, figuring out my next move. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see her in that bed, with some random guy, not even a hint of shame. The woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with wasn't just unfaithful, she was reckless, selfish, and didn't seem to care who she hurt. But I wasn't the only one she'd hurt. James had been avoiding me since our confrontation, and honestly, I didn't give a damn about him anymore. But then, out of the blue, he called. It wasn't just to apologize or check in, he'd found out something else. Something that, somehow, managed to make the situation even worse. Hey, man, James started, his voice heavy with the same exhaustion I was feeling. I've been doing some thinking, and, I found out something about Jess. I sighed, leaning back in my brother's kitchen chair. What, James? What else could possibly make this more of a disaster? She's been cheating on me, too. That hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't even sure how to process it. Jess had been lying to both of us. Not only had she been sneaking around behind my back with my best friend, but she was also cheating around behind his back with other men. It was like everything about her had been a lie from the start. I found some messages, James continued, his voice flat, drained. There's another guy. She's been seeing him, too. I don't even know how long this has been going on, but I can't do this anymore. I'm done. The silence between us was suffocating. All I could do was shake my head in disbelief, even though he couldn't see me. She cheated on you, too. I finally said, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. I mean, wow. I guess this is who she really is. She just destroys everything in her path. James sounded defeated. I thought she was different, you know. I thought what we had was. I don't know. But this, man, she played us both. Yeah, I muttered, bitterness seeping into my voice. Welcome to the club. He was quiet for a moment before speaking again. I'm leaving her. I can't stay in this mess any longer. I should have seen it sooner. I should have known. You're doing the right thing, I said, feeling strangely calm. You and me both. I'm filing for divorce. The words felt heavy, but also, freeing. It was the first time I'd said it out loud. I had spent years trying to hold on to a marriage that was clearly built on lies, but now, I knew there was no saving it. Jess had destroyed any chance of that. "I'm sorry, man," James said, his voice sincere for the first time since this whole mess started. "I should have never gotten involved with her. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I'm glad you're getting out of this." "I appreciate that," I replied, though I didn't know if I could ever truly forgive him. He was right about one thing, though: I was getting out. After the call, I met with a divorce lawyer. It was surreal, sitting there in an office, talking about splitting assets and filing papers like we were discussing a business transaction, but that's what it had come to. The lawyer asked about infidelity, and I didn't hesitate to give him everything I had: Jess's affairs with James, the random guy I'd found in our bed, and who knows how many others. "Given the evidence," the lawyer said, glancing over the notes he'd scribbled down, "you've got a solid case. This divorce should be pretty straightforward." Straightforward. There was nothing straightforward about the devastation that had ripped through my life, but I nodded anyway. At least legally, this would be simple. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and final decisions. Jess didn't even try to fight it; she knew she had no ground to stand on. She tried to talk to me a few times, sent texts, left voicemails, saying how sorry she was, how she never meant to hurt me. But I was done. I didn't respond. I didn't owe her anything anymore. One day, I came back to the house to grab the rest of my things. Jess wasn't there, but her presence still lingered in every room, in every memory. I packed quickly, not wanting to stay in that place any longer than I had to. As I was about to leave, I paused in the doorway of our bedroom, the room where I'd caught her. The bed was still unmade, like she'd stopped caring. I stared at it for a moment, then turned and walked out for the last time. The divorce went through faster than I expected. It was like cutting a cord, sudden, clean, final. I was free. James left her, too. I heard through mutual friends that he'd moved out of their place and cut all ties. In the end, Jess was left alone, with nothing but the wreckage she'd created. The people she had betrayed, the lies she'd told, it all came back to bite her. No husband. No lover. Just, alone. And I felt no pity for her. She had made her choices, and now, she had to live with them. The weight I'd been carrying around for months finally lifted. For the first time in years, I could breathe again. The betrayal still hurt, of course, but there was something liberating in knowing that it was over, that chapter of my life was behind me. I had no idea what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never let someone like Jess tear me down again. I was ready to start over, to rebuild, without her shadow hanging over me. And she? She was just a painful memory of what I had survived. After the divorce was finalized, things slowly started to shift. It wasn't easy by any means. How could it be after everything I'd been through? But there was this strange relief that came with the paperwork being done, with Jess no longer being a part of my life. For the first time in months, I wasn't trapped in a cycle of lies and betrayal. I was free to rebuild, to figure out who I was without her. And, honestly, I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I was just numb. A few weeks after everything was settled, I got a call from a mutual friend, someone who hadn't really been involved in the whole mess but had heard bits and pieces. "You heard about Jess, right?" he asked, sounding cautious, like he wasn't sure how I'd react. I hadn't. I'd blocked her on everything after the divorce, cut off any ties that might keep me connected to her life. "No," I replied, a knot tightening in my stomach. "What happened?" "She's not doing so well, man. Ever since you and James left her, it's like she's lost everything. She's not working, not seeing anyone. I don't think she has any friends left. People have been talking. She's just alone." I didn't say anything for a moment. The news should have stirred something in me: anger, satisfaction, maybe even pity. But it didn't. It just felt like another sad chapter in this already tragic story. She had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. "Well, that's what happens when you burn everything down around you," I finally said, my voice cold. "She did this to herself." The friend didn't argue. He knew it was true. Jess had systematically destroyed every meaningful relationship in her life, mine, James's, probably others too. Now she was reaping the consequences. After the call, I found myself thinking about her more than I expected. Not in a longing way, but in a curious one. What was going on in her mind now? How was she handling the fallout of everything she'd done? Part of me wanted to know, but the stronger part of me reminded myself that it didn't matter anymore. I had escaped that wreckage, and I wasn't going back. James had moved on, too. He and I weren't close anymore, which was fine by me. We'd exchanged a few awkward texts after everything went down, but there was no recovering from the damage between us. I didn't hate him anymore, there wasn't enough energy in me for that, but the friendship was dead. And we both knew it. As for Jess, I heard bits and pieces from time to time. She had tried reaching out to a few people, but no one was willing to listen. Her reputation had taken a massive hit, and in a small town, people talk. Word got around about how she'd cheated not just once but repeatedly, and how she'd hurt the people closest to her. She was toxic, and everyone knew it. One night, while I was at my brother's, I decided to drive by our old house, just out of curiosity. I wasn't looking for anything specific, maybe some sort of closure, maybe just a final glimpse of what I'd left behind. The lights were off, the place looked empty, and there was this eerie quiet that hung over the house. I sat there in my car for a few minutes, staring at the home that once held so many memories. Good ones, even. But all I could feel now was this hollow ache, like it belonged to someone else, to another life. I had to let it go. I pulled away from the house, and as I drove, something inside me clicked. The weight that had been sitting on my chest, the anger, the sadness, it started to fade. I wasn't there yet, but I was getting closer to being free from it all. From her. Life went on. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. I threw myself into work, caught up with friends, spent more time with my family. Slowly but surely, I was building something new, something that didn't have Jess's shadow looming over it. Every now and then, I'd hear another update about Jess. She was living alone, struggling financially, barely making ends meet. She had alienated everyone who cared about her. She was a ghost of the woman I once knew. But I didn't reach out. I didn't check on her. I owed her nothing, and I wasn't going to let her drag me back into the chaos she created. As for me, I started to realize that I had a lot more strength than I ever gave myself credit for. Surviving something like this, it changes you. It forces you to grow in ways you didn't think were possible. And while I would never wish that kind of pain on anyone, I was starting to see that it had shaped me into someone stronger, more resilient. In the end, Jess was left with nothing. And me? I was rebuilding. I wasn't there yet, but I knew I'd be okay. I had to be. The hardest part of this whole ordeal wasn't just letting go of Jess, it was letting go of the version of myself that thought I needed her, that thought I couldn't survive without her. But now, standing on the other side of it, I realized I didn't just survive, I grew. And that was something she could never take away from me.